Sharon Hudgens, she is the only person I know that has interviewed and written an article for Stars and Stripe magazine, Julia Child. I mean, how many people do you know? I'm not talking about saw Julia Child on television. Interviewed her face to face in her, was it her house? Paris. And so anyways, that's a program that she presented here. You can go watch it on YouTube. Be one of the 100,000 people who've seen our programs on YouTube. By the way, at the end of this is live. So one of the things that we started right before the pandemic, in perfect timing, all of our programs now are live virtual. And then if you missed the live virtual, you can see it on YouTube after we post it on YouTube. So that's an advancement we've had over 5 years ago. And but Sharon has done a book on her taking tours to Russia and some Russian foods about her book that she wrote on Russian. Is it Caviar and Steaks? There you go. But she's also takes tours around the world. And she's one of the, and she doesn't like to brag, but I'll brag for her. She's highly coveted in the tourist industry to lead these tours. So I'm going to take you on a journey to Scotland tonight. And I wanted to tell you one last thing. When we had the slides up going over before the show started, one of them was Alexander Fleming. And I've always been partial to him. And I've also been partial to Robert the Bruce, because he basically kept Scotland as a separate entity, which is another story for another time. But when I was about 1.5 years, I had a severe case of pneumonia and was put in the hospital. And the doctor who was there had been in practice about 20 years. And he said, and I obviously survived, but he said, if this baby had been born when I first started practice, he would have died. And my mother said, why? And because Alexander Fleming came up with these medicines, and we don't see near as many of these cemeteries of little graves with little angels on them and little lambs. That used to be very common in the old cemeteries. Thanks to Alexander Fleming, much of that is a thing of the past. So the Scottish have contributed so much in science and culture, and you saw A. Conan Doyle, literature, and I'm going to let Sharon take it away. After Sharon's presentation, we will entertain questions. But before the pandemic, I took the microphone to you. For safety protocol, if you don't mind coming down here. Now, if you have mobility issues, I will continue to bring the microphone. Just wave at me, and I'll bring the microphone to you. Sharon Hudgens.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the microphone's on. I can hear it good. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm so happy to be here again because it's been 2 years since I was on this stage. In fact, it was 2 years this past December when I gave my reindeer lecture, which has also gotten a lot of hits on YouTube, of course, because it's reindeer, not because of me. But I'm so glad you're here tonight because I am glad to be here too. This was scheduled for March of 2020, and Tom had even arranged for a bagpiper to come and pipe you all into the auditorium. And COVID hit, and our world changed. And our world has changed again in this last week. So we all wait to see what happens. But tonight, what happens is Scotland. And so I'm going to be talking about daily life in the Scottish Highlands. Now, people have this idea of Scotland, that it's a place where the men wear kilts, and they wear this kind of a purse-like over their private parts. That's called a sporran. Well, they keep their cell phones in it now. They all play the bagpipes, and they play silly, crazy games, athletic games. They eat something terrible called haggis, which is made out of the stomachs of the cute little sheep you see on the hillsides. And, those stereotypes all have roots in the truth, but there's much more to it than that. However, we all tend to think of the Scottish Highlands as this romantic place of castles and ghosts and legends and lost causes, if you've ever seen Macbeth or Brigadoon or Braveheart. But there's really a lot, much more to the Scottish Highlands than just our stereotypical images of it. So I'm going to start by telling you how I became interested in this part of the world. This is a once upon a time story. Back when I was a graduate student in 1969, I had saved up enough money that year. This is not typical graduate student story. I'd saved up enough money that year to take my first trip to Europe. And I'll bet there's some of you out there in the audience that recognize this book. We all bought the first edition of Europe on, or close to the first, Europe on $5 a day. And that's what was our guidebook for getting around Europe. So what happened was I got a cheap charter flight that landed in London. I spent a couple days in London. It was too crowded and noisy and big for me. And so I took the Flying Scotsman train here to Edinburgh, which I liked better. It was much nicer. But I still wanted to get away from it all. So I got on the next train and took the train to the end of the line. And the end of the line is in a town called Thurso on the far northeast coast of Scotland. This, by the way, is the northernmost train station on the British mainland also. So let's see if can you see this little red? There we go. Okay, so let me see if I can get this on here right. So starting in London, and then took the Flying Scotsman all the way up to Edinburgh, and then took that other train all the way here to the end of the line up there. So that's Thurso. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of this tonight. And while I was up there, I was traveling alone in the Scottish Highlands. And I traveled by train, by bus, by ferry boat, and hitchhiking when there wasn't any other means of transportation. And I just fell in love with the whole Scottish Highlands. I ended up spending 3.5 months in Europe that summer, and I fell in love with Europe. So fast forward to the next summer, I decided I was going to move back to Europe, which I did. I lived for a while in Paris and lived for a while in London, but I ended up at the end of 1970 living in Heidelberg, Germany, another very romantic place, with the man that I eventually married, who's still sitting out here in the audience 50 years later. And he's not German. He was an American soldier stationed at U.S. Army headquarters in Heidelberg, Germany. And when he got out of the military the next summer, the summer of 1971, we decided that we were going to move to the Scottish Highlands. So we packed our 1967 Volvo station wagon with everything in the world that we owned. We even had our mops and brooms up on the top of it, tied on with a rope. And we took the car ferry over from continental Europe down here to, let me get there we go, came into Dover and then across the channel. And when we got there, immigration wanted to know how long we were going to stay and what we were going to do. They always ask you those questions, right? We said, we're going to stay as long as we want to. You don't say that to immigration. They said, where are you going to live? We don't know. We're just going to find a place. Well, what are you going to live on? Well, I actually had $1,250, which was all the money we had, from a job I had completed while I was living in Heidelberg. And that was enough for us to live for 6 months at $250 a month. So we got a 6-month residence visa for the United Kingdom and headed off to the Scottish Highlands. And so where are the Highlands? Let's take a look at that so we know what we're talking about geographically. As you can see, down at the bottom of the map, it's Glasgow and Edinburgh there, which are the places that most people go when they go on, foreigners come to visit Scotland. But then it's above there in the northwest part of Scotland that you find the Highlands. And we ended up in a place called Breitung. Bray means hillside in the Gaelic language, and it was the village, the houses on the hillside above the village of Tung. And underneath it, it has the word Tunga, which is the Norse name, the Viking name for this place, because it was built on a sea inlet. It's a little village on a sea inlet, and there's that tongue of land that sticks out into the sea inlet. So they think that's why the Vikings called it Tunga. And this is the route we took once we got to Glasgow down here. I'm having a little trouble with this pointer. There we go. And so we drove all this way up along the west coast and ended up in this town right here on the top, on the far north coast of Scotland. And that is in the county of Sutherland, which means Southland. That's what the Vikings called it, because when they came to Scotland, they came down from the north. They came from Norway, from the Shetland Islands, from the Orkneys, and down to here, and this became called Sutherland, Southland, even though it's the northernmost part of the British mainland. But people have been living there for a lot longer before the Vikings arrived or before we arrived. So in the Stone Ages, from the way on to the early Stone Ages, up until about 2500 BC, there are remnants of the people who lived there. And then these are some of the places. Have any of you been to the Scottish Highlands? How many of you have been to the Scottish Highlands? Okay. How many of you have been to the Shetland or Orkney Islands? No one. Okay, one. Okay. So this is on Orkney. And during the Stone Age, between 3700 and 2800 or so BC, this farmstead was built. It is the oldest preserved house in Northern Europe. Also on Orkney, there is a place called Skara Brae, and Skara Brae is Stone Age 2, and it's Europe's most complete Neolithic or new Stone Age village. It's older than Stonehenge. And what's amazing when you go there is there are still the beds, the bed frames made out of stones. They're still essentially like the dressers for your clothes and all. It's fascinating to see. And on Shetland Island, there is a place called Jarlshof from 2500 BC, and there they found the oldest pottery in Scotland. And after the Stone Age people lived in this settlement, it actually turned out that later some people, I'll tell you about, the Picts and the Vikings, whom you probably know, they arrived between 500 and 800 AD. So people have been living in this part of the world for thousands and thousands of years. During the Bronze and Iron Ages in Scotland, they've found a lot of artifacts that are left behind from those: pottery, tools, gold jewelry, and the oldest known measuring stick found in Europe too. And then the Romans came along. Now we're not in BC, we're in AD, okay, period. And the Romans came along, and they were in Britain from 71 to 410. But they made several excursions up into the really wild country, which was Scotland, and they never really had much control over it. They had military control over some places between 40 and 80 years, but that's the only extent of Roman influence there. But that's where Scotland's recorded history begins, in that period. The rest of it we just know from archaeology. Now, look at the name of these people. These are the Scoti. And between 300 and 900 AD, they came across from Ireland and settled on the west coast of Scotland. On the west part of your map there, you'll see it says Scots. And they spoke the Gaelic, or some people say Gaelic, language. And many centuries later, we get the term Scotland from the name of the Scoti people who settled there on the west coast. So Scoti, Scotland. And then you also have another group of people called the Picts. They're not really quite sure where they came from, but they lived in the central and eastern parts of the Scottish Highlands, and they eventually became allies with the Scoti, intermarried, etc., etc. They adopted the Gaelic culture, and that is what is finally the sort of the unification of these two groups finally led to the formation of what we call Scotland today. And then along come the Vikings between 700 and 1300 AD. All this time they're coming in different waves, making different settlements, etc. And so the Vikings came from Norway and from the Shetland Islands and from the Orkney Islands, came down from the north into the north and western part of Scotland. And there are a lot of Norse words in the language, like the name of the village where we live, Tung. So here's a map that kind of shows you where each of those different groups were. And again, you'll remember where we were living is right up there. The Middle Ages were a time of a lot of conflicts among different Scottish groups, a lot of warring between the groups. They also fought with the English who lived south of them. And at this time, a lot of the Scots, well, different groups of the Scots, made alliances with the French, military alliances and trade alliances. And that's why in the names of some of the foods of the Scottish upper class, you have French words, and you have some French influence in the language up there in other terms too. And during the Middle Ages, you had in the southern part of Scotland, cities and towns are beginning to be formed. And in the north, in the Highlands, you have the growth of what's called the clan system. So the Highland clans were the main social unit of organization in the Highlands. They were people of the Gaelic culture. They spoke Gaelic. And they were very isolated because the clans were essentially family groups, tribal groups. They were related by kinship. They lived in different isolated valleys. This is a really, really rugged part of the world. So if you live in this valley, you might not have much contact with the people who lived over the mountains in the other valley. And so that's how these distinctive clans grew up. And there is the Gaelic word for children is clan. All right, so it shows you that it's the family relationships that count. And they centered around their leader, the main god, the patriarch, who was described sometimes as a gentleman and a barbarian. And the clans eventually developed into the warrior class of Scotland. Later on, they became the landowning class. They became the lords who owned different sections of the country. Between 1706 and 1707 was the process of Scotland unifying with England. It was a very complicated process that went on over time for 100 years, and there were still a lot of Scots who didn't like it, and that's why there were uprisings and movements against the union with England. There were people in Scotland who still wanted to be independent. That's true today. If you keep up with the news, you will notice that attitude prevails, but at least they're not fighting. You see on the left, then, this is a sign of the symbol of the unity, the English rose and the Scottish thistle. The purple thistle is the symbol of Scotland now. And all of this dissension about union with England came to a head with the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And that was an important battle because that was when the clans rose up. They wanted a Catholic king on the throne, not the king who was there. The battle occurred on Culloden Moor. It's often characterized as between the Highland Scots clans and the English troops, but actually there were some clans that joined the English, and it's a much more complicated story than I'm telling right now. But the gist of it is that the Highland clans were defeated. So what happened was that the clans were suppressed then by the English, by the victors. They couldn't carry weapons anymore. They couldn't wear their tartans. They couldn't speak the Gaelic language. They couldn't play the bagpipes. All of these things that were characteristic of their particular culture were off the table now, supposedly. But, things change. And 100 years later, all of this changes. The idea of tartans and clans and bagpipes and all this romanticized notion of Scotland comes about again in the mid-1800s, only 100 years after the Battle of Culloden. And part of that is because Queen Victoria fell in love with the Highlands. And she and Albert bought this, it was actually smaller than this, they bought an estate called Balmoral. I'm sure you've heard of Balmoral. And they expanded it over the years. And it became very fashionable then. In the mid-1800s, in the Victorian era, all things Scottish became very fashionable. But there's the reality, and then there's the romance of the situation. The reality of the situation in the Highlands was that actually you had a few very wealthy, very powerful landlords who owned all of the land, or most of the land, and there were the rest of everybody else, the poor people below that. So there were huge class distinctions and big income inequality or wealth inequality. a lot of the landlords turned their estates into game reserves, private game reserves. The normal people couldn't hunt game or poach fish or any other any other kind of game on the land of these wealthy people. So these people were really in control. And then it was a question or a situation of great wealth and a lot of poverty. The people who lived there, the common, ordinary, everyday people, many of them were tenant farmers working on farms on the land owned by these wealthy landowners. And they had to raise crops and raise animals and then use those to pay the rent. Not as money. They weren't using money much. They were just paying rent to the landlord in the form of various crops and animals from their flocks and that sort of thing. And there wasn't much left over for them. So poverty was a big problem. And this also brings me to something that happened between the 1750s and the 1850s that's called the Highland Clearances. Because what happened is that those tenant farmers who'd been living on the wealthy people's land and growing crops for them and raising animals for them and all that, those people, the wealthy landowners, decided they could make a lot more money by getting rid of those farmers and pushing them off the land and raising sheep there again, because the market for wool was very, very good. And so a lot of those people, they were just evicted from their homes, sometimes with short notice. And sometimes the homes and their possessions were burned. And they were, this happened at different times in different places. I should say that it's not all in one time in one place, but over that period of 100 years. And what they did was they relocated those tenant farmers to the coasts of Scotland. And they relocated them to small communities that had to be built on totally barren land at the time. There was nothing there. They're called crofting communities. These people had a croft, which meant a small portion of land with the house that they could build on it out of stone. And they was very poor for raising crops. They could hardly raise enough food to feed their own families, but they still owed rent to the landlord because the landlord owned the land they were on. And so a lot of those people had to turn to fishing. They'd never been fishermen before. They'd been farmers and cattle raisers. And they had to become fishermen, but that meant they even had to build their boats. They had nothing. And some of them got into the kelp industry was big, harvesting seaweed too at the time. So that's how people managed to hang on during this really bad time in Scottish history, for the poor people anyway. And these crofting communities had a lot of difficulty. Overcrowding as people had children. There was not enough space for them to live. You'll get a sense of this when I show you an actual cottage from this era. They still had to pay rent to the landlords. And then along comes the potato famine of the 1840s. I'm sure you've heard of the potato famine in Ireland of this period, but it also happened in Scotland. And so the whole situation came together where there was not many opportunities for these people, and their life was getting worse and worse. And so that led to what is called the Great Migration from there. So people moved from the crofts to the cities down in the south. They also moved out from the Scottish lowlands down to England and Australia and Canada and Ireland. They moved to lots of places other than Scotland, to the extent now that there are more descendants of Scottish Highlanders living outside of Scotland than living in the Scottish Highlands. So what's the importance of all this history to the Scottish Highlands as they are today? Well, first off, it's an area that's really sparsely populated. Most of the towns, and they're really not big towns, they're small, most of them are small towns, mainly on the coast. The interior is mostly uninhabited. It's a huge space, open spaces. Lots of ruins. This is what it was like when we lived there 50 years ago. You still saw, you were 120 years past what had happened, and there were all the entire villages that were just ruins because people had left them and immigrated to other countries back in the 1800s. So I want to tell you something about daily life in the Highlands from the perspective of how we experienced there 50 years ago, and then how things have changed there too. When we were driving up from London to Glasgow and up the west coast of the Highlands to find a place to live back in 1971, we wanted to live on the west coast of Scotland. Both of us had visited there, and we just loved it. It was beautiful. It was dramatic scenery. There were some trees. The interior doesn't have a lot of trees, but you can see it was a really beautiful area. But this area wasn't developed for tourism like it is now. We looked and looked for a couple of weeks and couldn't find a vacant cottage to rent. And once you get up to a town called Ullapool up on the west coast of the Scottish Highlands, the land begins to change, and it looks like this. You can feel the curvature of the earth up there. It looks so primitive. You expect to see a dinosaur come walking over the hill. I mean, it's just, and we said, no, we don't want to live in a place, when we first saw it the summer before, we didn't want to live in a place like that. We wanted to live in some place on the west coast that was a little prettier. But where did we end up? We ended up in Sutherland, in that very place. And we discovered that Sutherland on the north coast, where we lived, is really very beautiful. It has its own beauty. It's got these rocky coastlines. It's got majestic mountains. And the mountains turn purple when the heather blooms. The landscape is very rugged. And the light is always changing. All day long, the light in the sky changes. Also, the weather. So we've had sleet and hail and rainbows and beautiful weather all in the same day. There's an old saying that if you don't like the weather in Scotland, wait 15 minutes and it will change. It changed even quicker than that up there where we lived. And we often had majestic, beautiful sunsets too. All the roads were single lane. And they said passing places to permit overtaking, meaning a way for you can pass. This was taken with a wide-angle lens, but that's a single-lane road, and you see over in the distance where it gets a little thicker, that's a passing place. So if you're driving there and a car comes up behind you, I mean, you could go all day and never see another car, but if one does come behind you, you pull over and let them pass if they want to. Or if one is coming toward you, one of you flashes your lights, meaning the other one can go, and you pull over into that passing place. There are more animals up there than people by far. Sutherland, when we lived there, was and still is, the least populated county of Britain. That was 4 people per square mile, and most of them would be along the coastal areas, not in the interior at all. So you had to be really careful about the locals, the real locals, other than the people, because you didn't see people very much. This is what I call rush hour on a Scottish Highland road. And this is Highland tailgating. So, as I said, we ended up in this little place called Braytongue, a few scattered cottages on the hillside overlooking the small village of Tongue. And this is across the sea inlet. This is that tongue of land that sticks out into the sea inlet, but all the way around here is sea. Taking the picture from out in that tongue of land that sticks in the sea inlet over to Tongue itself. And when we lived there, the population was 250 people in a 5-mile radius of our cottage. And let me see if I can get you where you can see where the cottage is. Right there, that little bit of white on there. And then right behind that, literally across the street, the land, or road, the one-lane road, then the land turns into moorland. So there's just cultivated areas along the coast, but not in the inland or anything like that. And this was the view from the other side. This is the view from our cottage, was to this. This is called, it's a little ruined watchtower. It's been named Castle Verich. They're not really sure what its origins are. Some think it's from the Picts. Some think it's from the 9th century. Some think it's Viking. They're not really sure, but you'll see it in a lot of photographs from up there. And this is the cottage where we lived, Burns Cottage. It has nothing to do with the Scottish poet Robert Burns. It was the name of the family that owned it in the 1800s. And it was built approximately in the 1820s. And this was a crofting community. This was the kind of house that the people who lived on the big estates as tenant farmers got moved into, or had to build when they got moved to the coast, and built houses like this, and would have a small plot of land to grow things on. This was 3/4 of an acre of land that it was on. And it was such a picturesque place. That was a postcard, by the way. The first one was a postcard from the mid-1950s. Because early 1950s, because electricity came to this place, to this town, in 1954. So these postcards are pre-1954. You can see we had really good views from there, too. And when we lived there, that's what it looked like. So we moved in 1971. And we found it's just a holiday cottage. It belonged to the lady who lived down the road. Her house was from the 1880s, and I'll show you a picture of it later. And she had inherited it from her husband, who'd passed away, and turned it into a vacation rental cottage. And so, people who came up there to fish for salmon or something might stay in that. So she had done that the year before, in 1970, so that's when the thatching came off, and they put shingles on the roof and built this shed out in back. And it's connected to the house, but that's your bathroom, indoor toilet, it was wonderful, and kitchen. And I'll show you a picture of the kitchen a little bit later. Coming around the side of the house now, you can see that there's also this little doll's house almost there. We didn't have access to that. I think she used it as a storage area now. That had been built sometime earlier. And the little red door over there, that was a tool shed and storage shed, and a shed to keep your coal in for the fire. And I learned much later, that long ago in the past, 8 or 9 people lived in this 2-room cottage without that extra little shed built on for a kitchen. So it was just 2 rooms, and then they added this one on, and the family of 8 or 9 people at any one time lived in that space. That little kitchen bathroom shed was 150 square feet. The cottage is 370 square feet, so 520 square feet total. That's the front of it, with climbing roses on the building. We paid £7 British sterling a week for rent and utilities, all included there, except for what we paid for coal for heating, which I figured out today, that was about $70 a month back then, and that'd be a little over $400 a month now. The walls were 2.5 feet thick, and the 2 rooms were a living room, originally living room, kitchen, and then a bedroom. This is not the living room of that cottage, but this is what the living room of the fireplace would have looked like before we moved there and before things had been upgraded in that place. So you can see that the fireplace, which also heats the cottage, there's a fireplace at either end of these cottages, very typical, and one heats the bedrooms, one bedroom, and one heats the living room kitchen. And so you can see that this is what you cook on. There's places for your tea kettle. These are things you move and put over the fire, different hooks that you can hang things on. Now this is what the cottage actually looked like where we live. The other one was from a museum of rural life in a house very much like the one we lived in. But that's what the old open hearth looked like. Sometime in the 1930s, this was put into that open hearth. This is a cast iron enamel stove. So here is where your fire would be. There's a trivet here that you could swing over the fire. That was our tea kettle. There's another trivet to swing over the fire for cooking. This is a baking oven, and this is a warming oven. And these copper pipes go here up to a holding tank above the ceiling, and that's where there was a water tank. So we always had hot water because the whole time we were there were only 3 days, summer, autumn, and winter, that we didn't have a fire in the fireplace. So as long as you had a fire in the fireplace, this is one of the days. It was a hot enough day that we could actually not have a fire in the fireplace. But normally that would be flaming, and then the heat goes up this way. And then there were other flues on the side to bring the heat up into the baking and warming oven. There were no modern appliances, no telephone, television, washing machine, and the stereo and the modern posters from 1970s and the Bob Dylan album are ours, of course. And the landlady's house was about half a mile down the road. And about a week after we got there, the landlady's cat moved in with us and lived with us the rest of the time. We love cats, and he made it very homey. This is the first selfie we ever took, 1971. But that also shows you the kitchen. Now, right here is a little closet that was our pantry. And then right here is where you had some drawers and a single sink. And then you move over to here, which you can't see, but just out of this side, there was a 3-burner electric stove, a regular stove with an oven, 3-burner stove, and a small table and 2 chairs. And then the other space of that 150 feet was a bathroom, which was only as long as the bathtub. And so there was a bathtub and a sink and a toilet. When we said, yes, we'd take this place to move into, we thought right behind where my husband's standing, there was a curtain covering up, hanging down from this counter. And we thought it was covering up one of those apartment-sized refrigerators. Until we moved in and started unpacking and realized there was no refrigerator. And then we lived there a few days and we realized why there wasn't a refrigerator, because you don't need one. This was July. Everything stayed cool enough so that if you had made enough food for dinner tonight and you've got enough for dinner tomorrow night, all you did was just leave it out on the table with the plate turned over on top of it, and it stayed cool overnight. Summer and autumn, once it got to be cold, then it froze. So every time you got up in the morning, all your food was frozen just by leaving it out on the table. Also, the toothpaste froze solid in the bathroom, so that was a little bit of a problem too. And you see the wallpaper on there? Well, now I showed you the picture of what that little wooden shed looked like from standing up on the road looking at it. All that is wallpaper just pasted onto those wooden boards that are outside. There's no insulation. That's why it was so cold there. And when the gales blew 100 to 125 miles an hour, and we did have a lot of gales there, then this wallpaper billowed out from the walls. It was a really interesting experience living there. There was no counter space, of course. But who cares when that's the view out your kitchen window when you're doing the dishes? You know, you just don't even worry about the rest of it. This is what the bedroom, the other room, looked like. So there's just a little small clothes wardrobe there and a little small dresser and a fireplace. And this is the bed. My husband's 6'2", all right, and this bed was not that long. It's also a 3/4 bed. It's halfway between a twin bed and a double bed. And so we had to sleep on the diagonal. I'm shorter, so I got the shorter end of the triangle there, and he got the hypotenuse. And in winter, I'm trying to remember what we had written on that paper behind the bed, but I tried blowing the picture up, and I couldn't find it, and I can't remember it that long ago. But we've still got that Scottish blanket. In the winter, it was so cold, and we didn't have a fire in the fireplace because that wasn't safe overnight. So in the winter, we wore Army long underwear, 100% wool long underwear. He'd gotten all this stuff from the Army store before we left to move to Scotland. So we had the tops, long sleeve tops, 100% wool, bottoms 100% wool, olive green Army wool socks, olive green wool caps, stocking caps, and Army gloves. And then I would put on a nightgown, flannel nightgown over that. He would put on pajamas over that. Someone said it must have been really sexy, if you could see an ankle, and probably true. But then we slept in cold weather sleeping bags on that bed with that and another Scottish blanket on top of us. And in the morning, this is when it was really cold. This wasn't, earlier on. But in the morning, we would get up and take off. He'd take off his pajamas, I'd take off my nightgown, leave on all the rest of the wool-long underwear and the gloves and everything, put on 2 pairs of corduroy pants and 3 wool sweaters for him to go out and get the coal out of the coal shed and build a fire in the living room fireplace, because we would be having our breakfast in there. So there's me with the gloves having my cup of tea in the morning. And I think I've only got 2 sweaters on in that one. As I said, we had a fire in the fireplace every day but 3 days of the months that we were there. And it was a fire, a coal fire. We wanted to burn peat, and peat is the fuel of the highlands. It's organic matter, it's like turf that is slowly on its way to becoming coal. Millions of years from now, it will be coal. But right now, it's close to the surface, and it burns. It's got a lovely aroma, and there's Scotch whiskies that have peat smoke, the aroma in them that are wonderful too. And see, they cut it like this from the land. But because we were renters and we were not people of the land, we were not allowed to burn peat. So we had to buy coal instead to have a coal fire in our house. I will say that one of the things I've seen the last time that we were up there, and I'll tell you more about that later, but they actually have now, like we have bags of charcoal for sale for barbecues in our stores here. Well, now they have little bags of peat for sale for people who want to put in their fireplace. But you couldn't do that. It was not allowed when we lived there. We had to buy coal and a few other minor food things. There was an old-fashioned grocery store there, the kind of grocery store where you went in and asked the guy behind the counter to take what you wanted, this one off the shelf and that off the shelf, etc. No self-service, nothing like that at all. There were also mobile food vans that came by, like a fish truck or a meat truck. This one's a fish truck. I love the fact that the cat's waiting there for the fish too. There was even a local dental clinic that came by once. We never had enough money to buy from those, though. I must say, I looked at them, but we were so poor that we weren't really poor, but we didn't have money. Let me put it that way, that we couldn't afford to do that. When I needed yarn for knitting, I went to the local weaver there, had a weaving studio there as part of his house, and bought the yarn from him. He's got yarn hanging up there in the top there. And he was also our postman. I'll tell you a story, since there's a war going on now elsewhere in Europe. Just remembered this one. One day I woke up and heard boom, and even the cottage with 2.5-foot thick walls was shaking. And every 3 minutes, but I could time it. I mean, it was always the same amount of time. Boom. This went on for about 2 days, and I said, Tom, do you think World War III has started? Because we had no way of knowing. We didn't get a newspaper. We didn't have a TV. We didn't have radio that would get anything. We couldn't understand Gaelic on the radio, and the radio shortwave reception was pretty bad. And so he looked at me and he thought for a while, and he said, well, if the war had started, surely the postman would have told us. And that's really the way you lived there, that you had that sense of being just, well, the rest of the world is out there, and eventually we'll find out about it. To get necessities like food, more food, and at a cheaper price than was available at the local tiny grocery store, we drove every 2 weeks over to Thurso, that town I'd been to originally on the northeast coast of Scotland, the town I went to the first time when I was up there. Drove through a landscape like this. It was 55 miles each way. It took 2 hours to go 55 miles. And in winter it took 3 hours. And we went twice a month and got grocery supplies in Thurso. Thurso was the largest town in the northern part of Scotland. 5,000 people and 2 traffic lights. And 2 supermarkets. So this was like modernity to us. So that was where we would stock up on stuff. And then we stocked up for 3 weeks worth of it in the winter in case we got snowed in. We also needed to do our laundry. I told you we didn't have an automatic laundry in the cottage. And the only automatic laundry in the entire north of Scotland was in Thurso. So we would drive over there, and I would sit and do the laundry, and Tom would go do the grocery shopping, and then that was our big outing for the day. But remember, it took us 2 hours each way to get there, 3 hours each way in the winter. If we didn't do that, the only option was you stomped your laundry in the bathtub and then hung it out, and once it filled up with ice, you go beat the ice out of it, because that's pulling the water out of it. You beat the ice out of it and then dry it in front of the fire. Well, winter. When did winter get there? In September, Tom was walking along the road up by our house, and one of the local shepherds came by with his flock of sheep and said hello to Tom and said, "Yeah, I have a question for you." Tom said to him, "Tell me what," because we knew we were going to be staying there a while. Tom said, "What was winter like here last year?" And the Scotsman said to him, "Och, nary a drop of the snow." "Okay," said Tom. So he told me about it, came in. He said, "It must be because the Gulf Stream goes up around here in the North Atlantic, because we're right on the Atlantic coast, and that probably keeps this area a little warmer." Well, this picture was taken October 12th. That's the day of the first snow. Tom was up at the top of the road, and the shepherd comes by with his sheep. And Tom looks at it. The guy said to Tom, "Oh, hard frost today." And Tom said, "Hard frost?" He's looking at this. And Tom said to him, "You told me last year there was nary a drop of the snow." And the Scotsman said, "Oh, that was last year. Normally the snow's up to here." You learn to ask the question you want to get an answer to. Tom had asked about last year. He didn't ask about what snow was like normally up there. So it was October 12th. The snow came. And as winter went on, we were only up there through November, so July through November. But you could see the deer coming down. We had 55 deer came down from the mountains and coming down to warmer area around us. The snow kept coming on. That's me coming out of the post office in the snow. And the two of us in front of an ancient structure called a broch, B-R-O-C-H, one of the ancient structures that still exists up there from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We also found out, going through all of this, living in Scotland in the winter like this, that happened, we didn't know at the time, but was very good training for when we moved to Siberia, where we lived through winters too. And as it came to be around Thanksgiving time and our visa was running out and our money was running out, we knew we would have to leave. And we had gotten where we really liked it up there. It was going to be really sad to leave because we'd had such wonderful experiences. But the snowplow only comes through once a week. And if the snowplow didn't come through that week, then we wouldn't have to leave. We'd have an excuse for overstaying our visa. But unfortunately, the snowplow did come. And so we went back to America and to grad school again and all the other things you do when you're in your 20s. But we kept really good memories of the whole experience that we had up there, the life we had up there. And the thing is, we were so afraid to go back and to see that it had changed that for 30 years we didn't go back. We were afraid the cottage would have been torn down, apartment buildings would be there, whatever. We lived all over the world in several different countries, but we didn't go back to Scotland because we were afraid of what might happen. And then in 2001, I said, "Tom, it's the 30th anniversary of when we lived there." I got a magazine assignment to write about how life had changed, and I said, "Let's do this. Let's go. Let's do this magazine assignment." And we followed the exact same route that we had done before: Glasgow, up the west coast, all of this around, and we went back to Tongue. We had not been in contact with anybody there. We didn't know what had happened there, to our landlady or to the cottage or anything. the city limit sign had gotten upgraded. Now it's not in Norse Tunga, it's now in Gaelic, the part of it in green. And this was our landlady's house. As I said, it was about half a mile down a paved road from where we lived, off a dirt one. And we drove up in our car, and she was standing in front of the house. And we rolled down the window and looked at her, and she said, "Oh my gosh," she could not believe. Here we were now in our 50s instead of in our 20s. And we had come back to see the town and to see her and to see the cottage. And indeed, the cottage was still there. As you can see now, the outbuilding in the front, the kind of little dollhouse-looking thing that was there, is gone. And most of the garden, it's really kind of stark-looking, but all the nice golden gorse blooming around, it's nice. She took a picture of us in front of the house and took us in to see what it looks like. And see how it's changed now? I mean, they put in an electric heater in that wonderful place where the fireplace oven was. Oh, you can't cook in the living room anymore. The bedroom, look at that. Oh my gosh, this was just to us unimaginable that they could have, spruced it up so much like this. But I have to tell you, the kitchen and the bathroom were still the same. No refrigerator. But the view from the front door was the same. Nothing had changed. No condos went up there. And the view from the kitchen window was still the same. So we were pleased to see that. We also went into town to see there was the store where we had bought groceries before. Still there, upgraded a little bit. The mobile food van still came. And we had to do our laundry because we were traveling, right? So we drove from Tongue all the way over to Thurso again to the only automatic laundry in the north of Scotland. And we did our laundry there, and the manager was on site, and we told him the story of how we used to come there all the time in 1971. And he laughed, and he says, "Well, I'm glad you came today because you're using the same washers and dryers you did then, and we're replacing them next month." So a little bit of laundry nostalgia there. Well, we waited again, 17 more years. And I finally decided I really wanted to write a book about daily life up there as we experienced it and the things we've seen that have changed there. And so we did the same thing in 2017. We drove up from the south, from London, and we took exactly the same route. I've got a map that I had all this marked on. We took exactly the same route back up here to Tongue again. And the city limit sign. And now the cottage. I had, in doing research before we went, I had found out that our landlady, whom we saw in 2001, she had passed away in 2004, and her children inherited the cottage, and they sold it to a man who lived in the far southern part of Scotland, right near the English border. And he was going to fix it up and turn it into just a vacation cottage for him and his family. And I got in touch with him and found out that he got into the project of renovating it, and the roof was rotten. There was all kind of rot between the stones and the walls. There was just a tremendous amount of work, very expensive, and he lived hundreds of miles away from it, so it wasn't something you could just do on weekends. So it was just going derelict, and eventually, I'll tell you what happened then. But you can see now the wood is rotting on the shed that has the kitchen and bathroom. And see now, it was in bad shape. I mean, this is in the summer of 2017. But the rose bush is still there. That's the same rose bush from 1971, still blooming. He sent me some pictures of what, we couldn't get in. The door was rusted shut, and the old guy who had the key to it, it didn't work out. So the man who'd bought it sent me pictures of what some of the work he had been doing on it before he decided to give up that project. So you can see. Yeah, so there's a hole in the roof now. I mean, and look at the slate floor. And of course, we went on into the village of Tongue itself. And now it says, welcome to Tongue in Gaelic, and then tourist services in English. And now there's all these shops, tourist services. I mean, nothing like that when we lived there. This is a view of the village now. Let me show you the cottage is still right there. A lot more trees now have grown up in that 47, 46 years. The village now, at that time, had a population, the whole area around there, of 560 people. And I think the population density for Sutherland has now gone up to 7 people per square mile. The post office, where you saw me coming out of the post office in the snow, still there. This was a tea shop back in 2001. Now it sells coffee, and it has outdoor seating, which means tells you something about global warming. You couldn't have done that at all when we were up there. The same grocery store has been taken over by the Dutch company Spar, and is actually a little self-service mini mart kind of thing. The mobile food vans still come. The fish van stops here on Wednesday, 1 p.m. approximately. And we still had to do our laundry because we're traveling by car, and it was time to do that again. So where do you think we went? We drove the 55 miles over to Tongue and went to the same laundromat and did our laundry and told the ladies who were running it, told them the story, and their replies, don't wait so long to come do your laundry next time. It had only been 17 years since we were there the last time. So what's happened now to Scotland, the Scottish Highlands, we discovered, it's really being developed for tourism in a way we could not have imagined when we lived there. And now they have the Scottish Development Board and all the people that want to develop this area, official boards, put together a driving route, which happens to be exactly the same driving route we took because that's where the only roads were, the one-lane roads. And there's some that goes down here. And it is called the North Coast 500. It's a 516-mile route. They established this in 2015. They've got a big guidebook for it. So what they're doing is they've got this, they're promoting tourism here, and there's all kinds of hotels and tourist cottages and lovely B&Bs and restaurants and food you can't imagine, wonderful food. It's just a big change in half a century. It's a popular spot, a popular route for vintage car and rallies and biker rallies. The problem is that these roads now are bumper to bumper in the summer with tour buses and cars, and people are not used to driving on these one-lane roads like this. The first year they started this tourism route, they had a 45% increase in traffic accidents and deaths. It's really a problem. We stopped at a gas station that was super busy, cars lined up, just in a little gas station by the side of the road in nowhere. And I was talking to the guy who ran it, and I told him when we had lived up there before, and he said, when you lived here in 1971, these were just our roads, your roads and my roads. But now they're a route. All right, they're official. They have a lot of nice signage up now for these, a lot of promotion. They have widened some of the roads, not all of them, but some of them are actually now 2-lane, which doesn't matter a thing to the locals here. They say it's my road and I don't care for you. Yeah. So what kind of changes have occurred? Well, the population's getting older. I heard this when we lived there 50 years ago too. Decreases in social services, doctors, nurses, teachers. I just read something this week that said the local school in Tongue has maybe 20 students left. There's not many activities. When we were there last, the lady we stayed with, she has 2 children, and she was saying their daughter wants to take ballet, but she would have to go 100 miles each way to do ballet, the closest place. There's not much economic opportunity for people, so of course young people are leaving. There are advantages too. There are reasons why people do choose to move there. It's got really clean and quiet and peaceful. There's really good wildlife, and I mean the animals, not the nightlife for the people. The crime rate is low, and of course there's wonderful scenery. The problem is house prices are getting really expensive, And so a small house can cost you $250,000 easily. The weaver's cottage, the weaver I used to buy yarn from, I saw his house on the market just this last year for $500,000. It's extremely expensive. Locals can't afford that unless they've inherited it from their ancestors. One person that's rather interesting is a guy I call a capitalist conservationist. And he is like, what's happening up there, a lot of foreigners are coming in and buying up the land. And it's just like when the wealthy landowners 300 years ago established big estates. There are people coming up and buying huge tracts of land, and he's the biggest. His name is Anders Povlsen. He's a Danish businessman, 50 years old. He's known as the latest Viking in Scotland since he's Danish. He made his money. He made billions. I think he's worth $6 billion in a fashion empire in Denmark and elsewhere in Europe. He's the richest man in Denmark. He's also the richest man in Scotland. And he's a very private person. He owns more land than anybody else in Scotland, and that includes the Queen of England and the church combined. Yeah, more than a dozen Scottish estates and castles. He is, though, a passionate environmentalist. And I put on this end, the last list there, he had 4 children. He had 3 daughters and a son, and it was assumed that this is a family, privately held business that he has, that they would also take over his environmental concerns, too, in Scotland. In April of 2019, his family was in Sri Lanka on a holiday for Easter, I think it was, and that's when there was that terrorist attack in Sri Lanka. His son and both of his daughters, 2 of his 3 daughters, were killed in that. So he was left with only 1 daughter in April of 2019. He now has 4 children. His wife had, the next year she had twin daughters, and the next year she had a son. So it's quite a poignant family story. His organization is known as Wildland, and he put almost $500,000 into shoring up the structure of that castle, that little watchtower, really, in the town where we lived. I don't know if you can see it, but there's scaffolding there and here. You couldn't get scaffolding up to there. He helicoptered it in, all right? He's got that kind of money and does that kind of thing. He's done a lot for wildlife conservation in Scotland, for reforestation in Scotland. On the other hand, there are locals who say, well, he's doing it for the animals and for the scenery, but he's not doing anything for us. So he is controversial, but he's also done good things. So no matter what you think of him, he is very heavily invested in Scotland. Now, one of the things that has just happened recently is they've finally gotten, he was very much against this project, but the people who live around there were in favor of it. It is called the Space Hub Sutherland. It's just being built now. This is an artist drawing of it, and it's right up very near where we lived. And it's going to be a vertical space launching platform for small, very small communication satellites. It's the first one in Britain. It's also supposedly going to be 90% carbon neutral and create 40 jobs in that area, which means a lot in the small area like that, and maybe 250 jobs regionally for construction, for maintenance, for operation of the Space Hub. And I'll show you where it is. You now know from the map where we lived, which was right there, and it's just right across the sea inlet from where we lived. So I'm going to end with the picture of a sunset I took over the sea inlet at Tongue the last night we were there in 2017, and tell you what happened just briefly to Burns Cottage. It was sold to a family-owned company that has several rental cottages, holiday or vacation cottages around the British Isles. And they bought Burns Cottage. It was derelict. They are restoring it. They're going to put in a modern kitchen and bath added onto it. They're going to take some of the photographs that I sent them from when we were there and the postcards, and those will be up on the walls there. And so Burns Cottage is coming back to life, and I hope that my husband and I are going to be the first people who get to stay in it when its doors open again. Thank you very much.
Before I any questions, come on down. But I first met Sharon about 10 years ago. We were featured some movies here in the auditorium, and one of those movies was about a feast. And that's all what the movie is about.
Babette's Feast, yeah.
Babette's Feast.
Babette's Feast, yeah.
And it said in the caption in IMDb, the database, that a lady named Sharon Hudson was the culinary consultant for this movie. And I thought, well, I'd love to have her. But I figured she was since the movie was based in what? Denmark.
Yeah.
I thought, well, she's probably from Europe. She's from McKinney. So she came down here and talked about Babette's Feast, and I was amazed. I'm not going to let you do it tonight, though. How the people would raise their hands and said, I tried this recipe, and it didn't work. And I remember one of the things you said was, well, those recipes are based on European humidity and
European
measurements.
European measurements.
And that's why it
Very
didn't
different.
work.
Yeah.
And you should have seen the people in the audience interact with her. And she didn't use any notes or any Google or anything like that. For 1 solid hour, they were talking recipes. And she's the only person I know who's prepared that whole feast, because that's what the whole movie is about.
Yes, yeah. We did it as a dinner party, friends of ours, when we lived in Germany. And my connection with it is actually that one of the people I know, she is the woman who dubbed the German version of it. She played Babette on the German version, just on the soundtrack, because they dubbed their films into German. And that was a Danish-French co-production. So one evening, she and her husband suggested we all get together with our friends in Munich and recreate Babette's Feast, and we did. And it was a wonderful experience. I would love to do it again.
Questions? Come on down. Don't be bashful.
People don't want to get up out of their comfortable seats, right? You can shout out a question. We can try it.
We'll do that. If you have a question, I'll repeat it in the microphone so everybody can hear. Any questions? What was the big food?
Thank you for asking. I should have said.
Tell them the question.
Yeah, the question was, what was the big boom? I was telling about the big boom sounding we kept hearing that was shaking the ground, shaking the cottage. And my husband, and when I said, do you think World War III started? And he said, no, the postman would tell us. It was indeed naval shelling. It was, I was right. It's what it sounded like. And there was a warship. They were doing NATO exercises off the coast of Scotland, and they were shelling into the sea. Yeah, but it was really hitting loudly from where we were. Thank you for asking. I should have made that clear.
What's your question?
That's a really good question.
I got to repeat the question for the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
How did you occupy your time, and what did you learn about each other?
I have to say that it was our first year of marriage, so you can guess. And we did discover that whenever we, would eventually retire at this age, that's really what we like to do. We liked being together. We didn't have any problem with that at all. But the other thing is, really, how did you occupy your time? If you're living in a place like that, and life is not as easy as it is here, it's more time consuming to put on all those layers of clothing all the time, and to build your fire every day, and to make all 3 meals. There's no going out to a restaurant. There was a small hotel in the town. We couldn't afford to go to its restaurant. There was a pub. We went twice the whole time we were there because we didn't have the money to go otherwise. And so we cooked all the time. And we did have some cookbooks with us. Both of us loved to cook. I eventually became a professional food writer and cookbook author. And part of the book that I'm working on now about Scotland is going to have the recipes from some of it from that era. So yeah, when you cook 3 full meals a day, a lot of it in the fireplace, you're making all your own bread in the fireplace oven. And then we had 3 what are called teas during the day, which means, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and then before you go to bed, you're having hot tea, cake, slices of cake, cookies. You got to eat to keep warm. So we just spent a lot of time cooking. We didn't have a newspaper. I think one time we took a trip to Inverness. That was an overnight trip. It was amazing, and we bought. We went to a Chinese restaurant. We saw Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid at a movie theater, and we bought a Newsweek magazine. And we had that. But we had carried with us a lot of books to read. We also did a lot of photography. We've had an exhibit of our photographs from Scotland. It was held at a place in Munich later on in the 1980s. And so we did a lot of things like that. It's a very good question. And what we learned about ourselves is that we could live together, and that's why we're still here 50 years later together.
Questions? Your question. Did you make any friends while you were there?
No, and that's a regret I have, truly a regret. We knew we were only going to be there a few months. The Scots are very reticent, very, very quiet, reticent people. Village life is not something you get absorbed into easily. And my husband's an introvert, so I'd be the only one out trying to make friends anyway, all right? And so we were hesitant to try to step over any boundaries of trying to make friends there. And they just assumed when we moved there in July that we were going to be like, regular tourists who stay for a week or two and leave. And I will say that come September 1st, when we didn't leave, then people were more open to us after that because they were surprised. You stayed, and then the snow came, you stayed. It was like, why are you doing this? And why are you young people up here when all of our young people are leaving? And so we didn't really get to know people. Our landlady was very nice, and every week when I went up to pay her £7 in cash in rent, she always had tea and little pancakes or coffee or and cookies and cakes for me. And we would sit and talk, and I got to know some things that way. I have actually learned more in doing the research for this book now because I have gotten to meet her daughter, one of them, who was 9 years old when we lived there, and now she's a grandmother 3 times over, and have been to her house and have talked with other people in the village since then. And I know more about them now, but we still haven't. It's truly a regret. But I think if you've ever tried to move from the Yankee North to a really small town of 500 people in Texas or 250 people in Texas, you would know that it would be a long time before you got accepted there and before you felt like you could talk with people as friends and that they felt that they could with you. So I think that, unfortunately, is what happened there too. But it's a very common situation. That's a really good question, though.
Questions? So far, real good questions. Yes, ma'am. The question is, did your parents send you care packages?
Yes. Well, actually, they thought we were weird doing this anyway,
Remember, she's a girl from Fort Worth.
No, I'm from Denison.
Oh, Denison.
Denison. They were living in Fort Worth, but I was born and graduated from high school in Denison. And then my family had moved to Fort Worth my senior year of high school. So that's where they were, was Fort Worth. And actually, I have to say that when we were up there, probably it was about by August, my husband and I were both feeling pretty run down, physically run down. And he said, we're not getting enough protein. All we could afford was 1 pound of ground beef every 2 days. So we were getting half a pound between us, or 4 ounces of ground beef between us. That was really the only meat protein we were getting that we could afford. And he said, he said, we need to write to your parents and ask them to send us protein powder. I didn't even know what that was. And so we did, and they sent us a big container of protein powder, and that made a huge difference in our lives. It really tells you something. Think about people who are actually poor and can't afford to put food on the table. What it does to just their stamina and all that. And we found that, having protein powder mixed up with our oatmeal and stuff in the morning made a huge difference. That was the only care package, but I did have a cousin who sent me a subscription to the New York Review of Books. And of all things to be reading in Scotland was wonderful. And that was the only thing we got that came in the mail, anything like that. But again, we were only up there a few months. It wasn't like if you were there longer when people would start. And mail took a while. There's no telephoning. there's no smartphones, there's no texting. I mean, we had to hand write a letter and then take it down to that little post office and then wait maybe 2 or 3 weeks to get a reply because of international mail and coming from that remote an area anyway. So basically, we're just kind of living in a 19th century existence that had indoor plumbing and electricity. And
The question is, did she have matches to start fire?
Yes, because, I mean, as I showed you in the pictures, there were groceries. There was a tiny grocery store there, and then the two supermarkets, small supermarkets, they're called 7-Eleven now, over in Thurso. Sure, so we bought all kinds of supplies. And I think it was really good that both of us liked to cook and knew how to cook. I think if we were people who'd, grown up going out to McDonald's or Olive Garden or something all the time and didn't know how to feed ourselves, it would have been much, much harder. We wouldn't have existed. And by the way, we have lived in that Burns cottage longer than anyone other than the family that it belonged to, the Crofting family. Because when we came back and we saw in 2001 and saw the landlady, she told us no one has stayed there renting it as a holiday cottage longer than 2 weeks. It's usually 1 week. And it's only in the summer. Nobody stays after the 1st of September.
I'm going to ask the next question. Oh, go ahead in the back. What's your question? Did you grow any vegetables or herbs?
No, I mean, when you're going to be 6 months at most, and you arrive in July, you're not going to be able to do a garden, and you're not going to be there to harvest it. I mean, even if you planted it. So no, not at all. And green vegetables, oh my gosh, we really missed green vegetables. And I remember one of those trips we went to Thurso to the supermarket, and they had Brussels sprouts. That was the only fresh green vegetable we had, was that bag of Brussels sprouts, and it was expensive to us. And we got them back to the cottage, and by the time we took off all the brown leaves, it was half a bag of Brussels sprouts. But I still remember how those taste. It was wonderful. We ate green peas a lot, unfortunately, and we were always having to buy the cheapest. When you go get canned beans and peas now, there's some cans of the same thing that cost more than others. We always had to buy the cheapest brand, and then you put it in a sieve and ran cold water over it in the sink, and the blue-green dye came out in the sink. It was horrible. So we mostly lived on that 4 ounces of meat and the protein powder, and then some friends did come to visit us there. A couple that Tom knew in the army in Germany, in the American Army, and they came and visited us, and they brought us a big can of chicken, white meat chicken. And I remember all the wonderful dishes that we made out of that. So isn't that funny that 50 years ago those things are still so fresh in the memory? Because they meant so much to us.
I'm going to ask the next 2 questions. One is, since you're the only person I know who has interviewed in person Julia Child, tell us at least one story. Since this is about Scotland, I don't want to talk too long about it, but we can't go away without telling us one story about Julia Child. And I'll brag about this. Her manager told her she had 1 hour, and when the hour was up, knocked on the door and said, "You have to leave." And Julia says, "I'm talking to her. Beat it."
That happened. Actually, we had only a half an hour, and Julia's manager came and said, it's Julia, your time is up for this interview. And Julia said, "Just please go away." And then the next 30 minutes later, again, her person came, her personal assistant, and said, "Julia, looked at the watch, and Julia said, "Please, we're talking." And then finally, after an hour and a half, this is interviewing her at the La Varenne Cooking School in Paris, Julia was going to be the honored guest at a big event, reception that started at 6 o'clock at night, and it was 5:30, and her assistant came and said, "Julia, you have to be here. You've got to be there in 30 minutes. And Julia looked at us. My husband was doing photography. Julia looked at us and said, "Can you walk?" And we said, "Yes, of course. Oh, come on." So we're interviewing her on the streets of Paris for 30 minutes, walking to the place where she was going to be the honored guest that night. So that was quite an experience. And what I thought was really interesting about her, and by the way, my stories about her are not different from other people's stories, because she was such a people person and she was so nice to everybody, and she remembered everybody. And that was 1984. I interviewed her in Paris. It was 1990 or 91 at the Oxford Symposium on Food in Oxford, England, and I was a speaker there. And they had a lunchtime at lunch always at this symposium. They had a buffet, and Tom was standing behind me in the buffet line. We were getting food, and he tapped me and he said, "Look who's behind me." And I looked, and it was Julia Child, and she saw us and she remembered us. From 1984, she remembered that we were professors for the University of Maryland, and that I also worked for the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and that's the occasion of interviewing her, and talked with us at the conference about that. Think of all the thousands of people that she has met, and she remembers, and she sends thank you notes. Whenever I wrote anything that mentioned her, or an article about her, I always sent a copy to her, and she wrote me a handwritten thank you note. And that story, if I could tell it to other people who know her or met her, they'll have a story like that too.
I'm going to go back to Scotland for a second. I'm going to tell you my personal Scottish story. My grandmother, growing up, she said, now she was very impoverished, growing up. Mm-hmm. And she said, we're descended from some king. And I said, yeah, right. What story is this? I said, well, what king was it? I don't know. What country? Probably Scotland. You don't know the name. So I never pursued it because I wasn't that interested at the time. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, years later, after she's dead and my mother's dead, I started doing genealogy. And I started noticing that going back, I could go back 700 years in my genealogy. Somebody was named in each generation for William Wallace. So I called one of the aunts up and I said, well, do you know Uncle Walt's real name was William Wallace? Well, I know that. Well, who was he named for? His daddy. I thought, I don't think she really knew who William Wallace was. In other words, William Wallace was such a legendary figure in Scottish history. Somebody had named in my family somebody from William Wallace. In the last couple hundred years, probably didn't know who William Wallace was. Right. Now, who was that king? Robert the Bruce. And I thought, well, how she grew up so poor, and he was a king, and he was a steward, and apparently the first son got everything. And if you were a daughter, and if your daddy loved you, he would buy you a marriage, and the other sons were just thrown out, to fend for themselves. Now, a lot of times they got the father would make sure that they had a job at the post office or something or in government or a clergy or something like that.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
But so I encourage you to discover your Scottish story. She's got some wonderful stories. Now, I always wear this kilt anytime we have any kind of Celtic program to honor my ancestors. That's what it's all about. And this is my question. I understand that 95% of the time the men don't wear kilts, but they do on ceremonials. Mm-hmm. And so and you mentioned it in your program. Can you just elaborate just a little bit on, did you attend any of the ceremonials where men wore kilts?
What we did was we went to the Highland Games that were held up there. And so a lot of people wore the kilts for the Highland Games, and the bagpipers all had on kilts and that sort of thing. But I don't think I would have ever seen anyone in the village. But then again, we weren't part of the village life that much, so we weren't down at the pub, or we weren't at the hotel where people who were, wealthy enough and might wear kilts for an occasion would do something like, in a wedding or something like that. But it's true. But there is one thing that now people associate certain tartan plaids with certain clans, and that is really kind of a construct. You can wear a Stuart tartan if your name isn't Stuart. It's part of that romanticization that came along during the time of Queen Victoria, and so there are certain clans that say, well, this is our plaid, but they'll wear other plaids too. So it's not the thing that we think of over here, that this is a rigid identifier of yours. I don't even know what yours is. Do you know?
Stuart.
Okay.
Now, I'll give you a warning. Do not tell a man who's in a kilt that has a dress on in Scotland, because you'll end up on the floor. And if you're a woman, you get a good cussing out. But it's a kilt.
Yeah.
Don't call it a dress. It's
yeah.
kilt.
Yeah, and don't call it a skirt.
And it's a really offensive item if you do that.
And they wear jockey shorts under them, because I have a picture at the Highland Games when the guy is doing tossing the
Oh, you took a
ball.
picture.
And as his kilt came up in the wind, I've got the picture of his jockey shorts. You bet.
I noticed you didn't have that one in there. One last question from the audience.
We've had some good questions
in the
here.
back there in the corner.
Yes.
Oh, we actually got two questions. Well, let's do her first since you hadn't asked a question. Yes, ma'am. The question is, has the government made any attempt to buy up land for conservation purposes?
I can't answer that question because I'm not that knowledgeable about it. It's one of the things I'm going to be looking into as I do research for this book, because I'm very curious about that. I know that there are, like, the government organizations bought this land, or with the consent of the people who live around there, for that spaceport. And this guy, the conservationist, didn't want him to. And by the way, what's interesting is the reason he was against it, and the reason some environmental groups are against it, is it's on peat land, P-E-A-T, the stuff I was telling you about that they burn. Peat holds a tremendous amount of carbon. And one of the biggest peat lands in Europe is up there in the northern part of Scotland. And so if any of that land gets degraded and the carbon can come up, it's really going to be harmful to the environment. So they're looking at things like that now. I don't know that 50 years ago anybody was even thinking about things like that. But land ownership in Scotland and in all of Britain is a really, really complicated topic, because there's what belongs to the king, there's what belongs to the church, that's what belongs to individual, people, and there were a lot of people who were low enough class that they weren't even allowed to buy land, etc. So it's a good question, but I cannot answer it. Yeah.
Are there any tours through Balmoral Palace?
I don't know. I would think there would be. Yeah.
Question back in the audience.
Last, way in the back there. Yes, you had a question? Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the sheep. Now, before she tells you about the sheep, I want to tell you, she gave such a delightful talk here a couple of years ago on the history of the reindeer. And go home on YouTube on a cold winter night and watch that reindeer show. But tell them about the sheep.
I will tell you about sheep. I absolutely love sheep. I'm a spinner and a weaver, and I love sheep. And I've got a garage full of boxes and boxes of wool. And part of it was being around all that in Scotland, seeing lots of different kinds of sheep. And what happened with the landowners back in the 1750s to 1850s, as I said, they had tenant farmers then, and they raised cattle. Cattle was and raised in the interior, in the valleys there. But sheep became more profitable. They aren't now, but they were then. And therefore, that's why you had all of these sheep brought in and raised in Scotland. And the wool industry was very big there. And the British wool industry was fed by the wool from a lot of Scottish and Midland sheep. And again, since 1970, competition from other countries, competition from synthetic fabrics and things like that has really just crashed the British wool industry. But how about this for a commercial? I have an entire lecture on the history of the British wool industry, and if you'll get Tom to put it on the
Would you like for her
skeleton,
to come back and talk about it?
And I've got wonderful pictures of the sheep there, including some that I wish they were so cute. I just wish that we lived there again and I could pick them up and go find the owner and buy that sheep from him and keep it in my
There's a question from that man right there.
No?
Didn't you have a question? I saw your
Yes.
arm go up.
I see an arm over there.
This is like the auction house. You raise your hand and get a question. Yes, but, in the very back.
Yes,
Yeah.
you.
The Highland Coos.
The Highland Coos. And I started to put a picture of them in. If you have not seen Highland cattle, anybody know what Highland cattle are? You know what a Texas Longhorn looks like? If a Texas Longhorn was a hippie, they've just got long hair that covers their eyes. They're long and shaggy. They're really pretty reddish brown. They're really very gentle animals. I have 160 slides in this show, and I wanted to put in the ones of the Highland cattle that I've got, because I've taken some pictures of them. They're very gentle animals. They're not like a Texas Longhorn when you're around them. I mean, I've walked among them in the fields, and they're just sitting down there and really cool. But they're beautiful animals. They're raised for meat. And that has been something that a lot of people now are raising them in the United States. They're raising them in Austria, several places, because they're good meat animals. But they really do look like a hippie Texas Longhorn.
One last question. The question is, she's going
someplace-
to Scotland for 10 days and wants to know where to go.
My hesitation is that there are so many wonderful, beautiful places. It depends on what you're interested in. If you're wanting to see castles and gardens and things like that, you would have a different location to stay in than if you wanted to drive that North Coast 500, all right, which is what I'd recommend, because the scenery is so beautiful and changeable. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my business card, and you can call me or email me and tell me what you're actually interested in seeing in the Highlands, and then I'll give you some recommendations at that point, okay? Is that good enough?
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.